Thank you very much for that really kind introduction. I couldn't object to a word of that. So I want at the outset to acknowledge the presence here of my two Council of Europe colleagues, is Emanuel Zingeris from Lithuania and Mr. Johannes from Armenia, whom I had a chat with last night. I hope I'm doing justice to the proper pronunciation of his name, but he's certainly a gentleman. I want to also at the outset to thank Mark Dunfried and Rosie from his staff and all the staff of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy here in Berlin for your very kind invitation to be a keynote speaker. I hugely appreciate that. And I must also thank you for the extraordinary hospitality that we have received over the last couple of days. It's so much appreciated since my arrival with you yesterday evening. Thank you very much for that. I think it's very, very important, or I should rather reference at the outset, the fact that we in Ireland have a wonderful sense of cultural diplomacy, in that our diaspora is about 5-6 times the size of our domestic population, and our diaspora have acted as cultural diplomats, if you like, for us right across the world with great effect. And in that context, I'd like to thank my European colleagues and all our colleagues in the EU for the extraordinary solidarity you showed to us throughout the Brexit period over the last couple of years. That solidarity is hugely appreciated, and we would hope that our ambassadors in our diaspora are a part of the reason for that. I think it's important that you're marking the fall of the Berlin Wall with this extraordinarily important conference. The fall of the wall broke down physical divisions, and we must not allow walls, whether they're physical, mental, walls of prejudice, walls of bitterness, walls of anger, walls of paranoia or xenophobia, to separate us from other people. We, all of us in this room, have a duty to be people who break down walls, who break down barriers. There's a curious link between the subject I'm discussing this evening, Brexit, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, in that it's an arguable thesis that when the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1990 then you had a united Germany, a very strong reunited Germany, that very strong reunited Germany posed a threat or posed a challenge or was a contender for dominance, for hegemony with the UK, and that in some respects it was that greater Germany that proved a catalyst, proved for the Brexit, or gave impetus to the Brexit movement within the UK. There are far many more elements to it than that, but it's not outside of the elements. So in that sense, the fall of the Berlin Wall had that unintended, as a commentator, very renowned commentator, Fintan O'Toole at home put it, an unintended consequence of the fall of the Berlin Wall, in some regards could be argued to be Brexit. There's no such a thing as a good Brexit. There is no good Brexit. Brexit loses the genius of the UK to Europe, the great parliamentary tradition, the huge educational tradition there. The genius of the British people is lost to the European project in Brexit. It loses money, 13 billion euros of UK money to the EU is lost. So there is no such thing as a good Brexit. And in fact, Judith Bunting, MEP from the Liberal Democrats, who spoke here yesterday evening, made the very good point that there wasn't, but she also argued that were a certain configuration to become the next government in the UK, and were her and our party to be part of that configuration, that there might well be a new referendum that would reverse the decision. I mean, that would be the ideal, but I suppose we have to talk about current realities in the meantime. The most malign, the most difficult, the most horrific scenario would, of course, be the hard Brexit. Now, I appreciate that the hard Brexit, the risk of a hard Brexit, has considerably gone, if you like, or faded away now. But having said that, it remains not a probability anymore, but it still can be a possibility in certain scenarios. So I want to look at the hard Brexit scenario, then I want to look a little at the soft Brexit, as they term it, scenario and the implications. First, let's look at the hard Brexit scenario for the renowned Good Friday Agreement, which effectively created the peace on the island of Ireland and was one of the great successes of recent times. Were there to become customs posts, checks on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, that border is now seamless. By that I mean people pass up and down. You barely notice the border now. You can drive up and down. There are actually, and this is relevant later, 230 crossings. But you can drive up and down without knowing that you're actually crossing the border now. So it makes for a great friendship, for a great trading relationships, for just indigenous business doing business across the border, families owning properties across the border, kinship, education, medicine, health. That's all normal and natural now. Were a hard border to come into existence, and were you to have either customs or were you to have checks on that border? First of all, let's look at the prospect of electronic checks. Satellites, that kind of stuff, which has been mooted. While they're questionable in terms of efficiency and efficacy and their capacity to do the required job, that's a questionable. In fact, they're not capable of it. But assuming that we were to take it at the where and the where to go into place, the first thing that they will do is attract violence, there's a dissident Republican grouping there ready and anxious to go back into business, and they will become targets for violence, for violent people. And once you attack the physical infrastructure, the logical corollary of that is that there has to be human beings, be they security firms, army, police, policing those. And then you get to another savage level of violence, and then you're back to where we all began before the Good Friday Agreement. Therein lies the real risk that goes with a hard border in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Another actual possibility that it's ironic that the Brexit, which was intended, if you like, to paraphrase Donald Trump, was intended to make Britain great again, was intended to make the empire great again, to make the United Kingdom powerful again. That the irony and the paradox of that is that it could well be the undoing of the United Kingdom, in the sense that it will accelerate the demand for Scottish independence and give it an impetus, because Scotland voted to remain in the EU and want to remain and would separate on that issue alone. If Scotland leave, that accelerates the movement for a unity in Ireland and the loss of the 6 counties, of Northern Ireland to the UK. So it'll break up the empire there. But there is a difficulty as well. If we have an overly accelerated, impulsive, unplanned, unstructured reunification of Ireland, which could arise as things are going, it well could replace the IRA with paramilitaries of a different colour. And if you were to have a united Ireland that did not have true consent, that did not evolve in a natural process, and that was only almost as thin a majority for it as there is for Brexit, that could again give rise to some awful consequences. So while I would aspire naturally to a united Ireland, and that's the aspiration of virtually all nationals and all people in the Republic, it has to come in a way that's not going to be conducive to violence, civil war, or difficulty of that nature. It's interesting now, having looked at the most obvious physical danger, the most obvious threat to the peace, to the Good Friday Agreement, it's not worthy of looking now at the economic implications of Brexit, because I don't have to tell you in this very educated audience, cultured audience, an audience of leaders from across Europe, and beyond Europe, from Africa and America also, I don't have to explain to this audience that when you have economic dislocation, when you have economic deprivation, when you have unemployment, it's a feeding ground for violence, for alienation, for societal troubles, for distress. And it feeds violence. And economic Armageddon, if you like, will recreate the violence and will undo the Good Friday Agreement in that sense, quite apart from the more macro way of looking at it. I'll try to look at some of the implications economically as efficiently as I can. The core issue here is that there is an extraordinary link between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, and obviously Northern Ireland, in economic terms, in trading, in kinship, and in the entire economic area. For example, and it's a lot in terms of our national economy, the export of services to the United Kingdom each year is in excess of 37 billion. The import of services from the United Kingdom is around the 31 billion. Foreign direct investment from the UK supports 80,000 jobs in Ireland, and amazingly, our investment, our firms in the UK support 86,000 jobs. The UK is responsible for 14% of total Irish exports. Goods from the UK are 26% of Irish imports. Now I'm coming to the truly serious part now. The agri-food sector is 40% of exports destined for the UK and Ireland. The beef sector exports 47% of its product to the UK, cheese 60%, mushrooms 90%. So the indigenous agri-food sector, the food processing that goes with that, the food growing, all the employment that goes with that is at serious risk if you have customs. And I'll come to more specifics there. So more than 40 billion worth of UK firms are in Ireland. So if we had a hard Brexit, and in a doomsday scenario, we had the WTO rules applying to trade, it would add 24% to the average cost of exports and 32% to the entire trade. Now, that would arise because of delays, because of extra administration, and because of the actual customs posts. So that would make a lot of the product areas, the margins are already so thin that it would make them unviable and would make a lot of the services sector unviable. So it would devastate the economy. It would represent a fall of at least 7% in Irish GDP. It would represent imports falling 7.7% and exports falling 8.2%. Last year, for example, tourism, and this is a very relevant part, between the UK and Ireland, tourism in Ireland, there were 325,000 visitors, and that's of enormous significance. 325,000 jobs are based in the tourism sector. And that's of enormous significance. And tourism can be affected by fluctuations in sterling. If sterling gets weak at a given time, and even the very fact of borders and the whole concept of not being part of the same European Union anymore will have an adverse effect on tourism. Now, those those are the implications. But let me for a moment talk to you about the implications for North-South. I've talked East-West there, Ireland versus the UK. Let's talk North-South for a moment. The North-South relationship in Ireland is enormously significant in that you have indigenous businesses doing business on either side of the border. You have farm produce passing to be processed from one place to the other across the border, and you have services crossing the border. So the conservative estimate of job losses in the whole border Northern Ireland region would be a minimum of 30,000. That's conservative. It could be much greater. And the job losses would come in the food processing, would come in services, would come in tourism as well. So, for example, I'll give you one concrete example of what I'm talking about, a human example, a real live example. The village where I live up in County Cavan in the Republic of Ireland near the border with Northern Ireland, it's a small village of about 3,500 people. We proudly call it a town of Ballyborough, and it's a very beautiful place with a great people there. But that has one big employer in the town. The best employment in the town there is in a milk processing plant called Lakeland Dairies. They're the best paid jobs, they're the most secure jobs. They're jobs that sustain families, college students, homes, mortgages, the entire lot. And there's over 300 jobs related to that plant there, and that's a huge amount in the context of the size of population. Now, that plant sources 56% of its milk north of the border, and it's brought down to be processed in Ballyborough. Were there to be a hard border, then that processing would have to move back north. It would cost a lot for the farmers to create. They have bought a potential processing plant there as a precautionary measure, but it would move back north of the border, thus creating mass unemployment and a dislocation in the town from which I come. And that repeats itself. I just cite that example because it's the one immediate to me. But that particular example repeats itself in every small town, village and community north and south of the border. So that's the difficulty you're dealing with there. So to return, now that's the malign scenario. That's the doomsday. That's the bad news. But were we to have a free trade agreement, which we would hope will arise between the UK, we'd have duty-free trade then for most products. We'd have some tariffs for sensitive products. And that would greatly reduce the difficulty. Were we to have the customs union as now, and as was part of the original Premier May deal, we would have a common external trade rules, common external trade, and we'd have no regulatory divergence, and that would be extremely good for us, and that's what we hope would come out. That to us is the second best option to which the no Brexit, as I discussed earlier, is the really good option. So in Northern Ireland you have 8,700 small business, as I said, 30,000 jobs, 200 million trade from north-south in the drinks sector, food and drink sector. So you have all of that. So, and if you have the economic Armageddon that follows from that, from the customs and the delays and all of that, then you will have the violence as a consequence. Now, the backstop would, the famous and much used term, the backstop, would allow Northern Ireland to adhere to the EU single market rules in goods and no border regulations. Now, the new revised procedures, an agreement between Premier Johnston and Michel Barnier on the European negotiators, has a number of elements that are favourable. Northern Ireland will remain aligned with the single market. There'll be no regulation. There'll be a a convergence or no regulation on goods, a common regulatory environment which will stop food checks and quality checks and stuff on the border. Checks and procedures on such goods will take place at ports and airports in Northern Ireland and not on the border. The UK authority will assume responsibility for applying the EU rules in Northern Ireland. UK's authorities will apply UK tariffs to products entering Northern Ireland, but only if they are not earmarked for onward transfer across the border. For goods at risk of entering the single market, the UK will collect EU tariffs on behalf of the bloc. EU rules on value-added tax and excise duties will apply in Northern Ireland, with the UK responsible for their collection. And revenues derived there will be held by the UK. Those are essentially the differences or the elements of the Johnston deal. And I might just make a cursory reference to particular scenarios at the end, but there's the key difference then from the backstop, where this new agreement is slightly different to the Premier May agreement and to the backstop, is that the arrangement will come into effect at the start of 2021, and at every 4-year interval, or at the first 4-year interval, the Stormont Assembly, if it's in place at the time, will vote on whether to continue to allow it. Now, it will be a simple majority, so it stops the DUP, and they're very unhappy about this, having a veto. So I suppose what I've outlined is 3 scenarios, basically. The no Brexit scenario, which is the ideal, the hard Brexit, which has absolute potential to bring about a return to violence at a very early stage, but also at a latter, as a developmental stage, will bring about violence through creating mass unemployment and confirming intergenerational unemployment and all that goes with unemployment and poverty and all that goes with that, and the anger that goes with that. Plus there's a generation of young men in Northern Ireland who do not remember what violence was like. They didn't live in the violent time, and they have kind of it's almost if you have no identity other than if you have a lot of problems with your identity and you live in poverty and you live in great deprivation, you almost develop a personal identity by becoming part of a cause, and a supposed romantic cause with the potential there to become for violence. So that can bring violence on that level, and then violence, as I said, through the economic poverty. Then the next situation, and that has the WTO rules, that particular one. Then the next best option for us is the free trade arrangement, which would reduce customs and there would be regulatory alignment, and that would be good. And then the next option, and the really good option, would be the entire customs union. So I suppose I'll just conclude by saying to you, it's sort of up in the air, in the sense that the UK election, one can assume that if Premier Johnston wins the UK election, that we'll have the deal that I just described. And then there'll be the working out of it over a 2-year period. And that's a good deal better than a hard Brexit. It's also conceivable that if the Liberal Democrats are part of a government, that they will make, as Judith said last night here, that they will, their MEP, Judith Bunting said, they will make it part of a coalition deal to have another referendum which Remain could shade it. One of the threats to getting Remain through in a referendum is that people have not yet experienced the pain. And until the people experience the pain that will go with Brexit and the dislocation of employment, etc., but they don't really get the need to vote for Remain, but hopefully it would shade it this time. I think, in fact, it would, and that would be a great outcome. Now, I have touched, my theme tonight was the peace and the maintenance of the peace, and it's a wonderful theme, and it was actually suggested to me by Mark here, your director, and in that it fits in with the entire idea of the Berlin Wall falling and the peace there and the reunification of people. Now, while I was addressing the peace in Ireland tonight, I should say, but I'll only say it in passing, because it's not tonight's agenda, it's not the material of my speech, that there will be great economic difficulty in certain areas of the UK, within England, within Wales, within Scotland. Actual economic problems are rising from Brexit as well, and that their economy will also suffer, because it's all predicated on the assumption that they will get new business in what was the old Commonwealth and a new trade deal with America. I mean, that's exaggerated because of distance and everything. They'd need to get 5 times, and the London School of Economics has confirmed this, they'd need 5 times the trade level that they all have with the EU, with external partners, to achieve the same economic objectives for GDP. So it's a very bleak scenario for the UK ultimately also, but that's not tonight's agenda. I just want to say that I'm hopeful, more hopeful than if I'd been speaking here last year, that it will be okay. So I look forward to your questions. I must say I made reference at the outset of my talk to what a joy it was to meet Mark and the directors here, and I referenced my good friend Emmanuel earlier. But I want to say that a particular joy for me, and the greatest joy of the few days, was actually meeting the students here. They're a very engaging group, very interesting, very friendly, very forthcoming, and very intellectually sharp, quite challenging in the questions they make. So it's with a little apprehension that I await their questions. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for this clear explanation of an incredible complex process. I'm completely with you when you say there is no good Brexit. I'm a European politician, I'm Portuguese, I've been following all this drama in a very worrying way. My question is the following. To what extent you think that the upcoming elections can become a game changer?
Yes.
And to be more precise, to what extent these elections can provide a kind of shortcut for a desirable new referendum?
Thank you.
These are my questions.
Yes, thank you for that excellent question. And indeed, could I pay tribute to your own wonderful keynote speech earlier today, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And could I also acknowledge the great support we received from the Portuguese government as well as our other European friends. And that's really appreciated by us in Ireland. Can I respond to your question in a couple of ways? We're all only crystal ball gazing here and speculating, but were Boris Johnson to get a working majority, one assumes that he would go with the agreement he's recently negotiated and that he would exit the EU, that we would have a Brexit, that it would be the more benign Brexit in that it would be the recently negotiated deal, which is better than a hard Brexit. It would be a pity that with the exit is so serious on so many levels, but that's assuming Boris Johnson had a working majority. If the Liberal Democrats, the polling data and the movement of the election would suggest that the Liberal Democrats may be part of a future coalition. Now, it would seem, listening to Judith Bunting last night and reading Liberal Democrat speeches, etc., that they are likely to make it a term of an agreement that there would be a referendum. And I personally believe that on balance that referendum it would flip the result. We'd have remained that time. And that would be a brilliant and wonderful outcome for Europe, for Ireland, for the UK. Because just, if I may say so passingly, this is not just about Ireland, about the UK, this is about Europe. The loss of Britain to the UK, apart from their money, their genius, their parliamentary tradition, the wonderful traditions of scholarship, of innovation, of scientific discovery. They're very, very brilliant people with a brilliant past and with a brilliant contribution to make to Europe. And they're an important part of keeping the peace in Europe. This has been the most successful peace project in the history of the world. And now we have a generation, as somebody said today, who didn't experience war. We've been managed to keep away from war for 70 years more. And that's the EU, that's the Council of Europe that myself and Emmanuel are part of. But it's the EU as well, because of the free trade, because of the single market, because of cultural diplomacy indeed, and the interaction between people there. So in essence, my answer to you is the election has the potential to get us another referendum, and I think we'd win that one. But at the same time, it has the potential to go with the last deal. Now, if the Brexit party were to do extraordinarily well, and if in some way they were to be the key partners in the government, then you're into a very dangerous scenario. But one just can't contemplate these things, certainly not publicly. Thank you.
We have the microphone up front, please.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful presentation. I have a question. If, hypothetically speaking, there is a hard Brexit,
Yes.
then there is scope for violence. How can it be avoided? Or what measures can be taken to maintain peace in case of a hard Brexit?
Well, as always, and we have a lot of practicing politicians here, academics, cultural diplomats, a lot of people here with a great collective expertise. But I think you would all agree that the way to avoid violence is to invest in jobs, invest in education, invest in housing, invest in services in deprived communities, invest in support and social services. And that's the answer. You do that, the potential to do that decreases or lowers as your GDP lowers, as your economy shrinks. And the economy would be shrinking in Northern Ireland, in the Republic, and to a lesser degree in the UK. And that has an adverse potential for the kind of investment that's necessary to avoid violence. But investment would. Of course, security, policing, all of that is part of the answer. But that's only dealing with the symptoms, not the causes. And we really need to deal with the causes. And the causes arise from unemployment, lack of educational opportunity, bad services, health issues, and therein, and intergeneration, very particularly intergenerational unemployment, and therein lies the issue. Policing is only dealing, as you can see in Hong Kong at the moment, it only treats the symptoms. It doesn't treat the disease.
Thank you, very kind. Here is a good place to say to you thank you for the last 2 decades contributed by you personally to the all possible committees in Council of Europe in Strasbourg together. Looking to your brilliant contribution to all kinds of human rights standards and other standards of cementing Europe. I'm coming from small, absolutely not important country, who actually is more like 85% of people are voting for enthusiastically for European Union until now. So I'm coming from museum, pro-European museum, archival museum from Baltic states in Lithuania. So looking from our side, you deserve, Ireland, deserve to have our extended solidarity in the bad case if the pro-Brexit party will be having on the 12th of December high election results. So which type, looking to European Union internal solidarity, which type of Marshall, small, tiny, PT, Marshall Plan, we can extend to you, not looking to those all horrors terrible horrors just presented by you, what can happen, including just the last question about violence and the old time when you have Londonderry and Belfast IRI ruling the mood inside of North Ireland. So how we can now start to think through our, when even British Commissioner will be not having no any place, just decided that British Commissioner will be not elected this time. So not looking to the results, it was just commented by von der Leyen. So how you will comment as union members of European Union, who are still cementing European Union, which type of support we can extend to you? Thank you.
Yeah, can I thank Mr. Zingeris for that extraordinary deep question that arises from years of parliamentary experience. And I must say, Mr. Zingeris himself, and I'm so sorry he had to miss his own keynote speech because of my flight times. Mr. Zingeris himself has made an enormous contribution to the Council of Europe, an enormous contribution to the development of the independence of his own country, in which he put his own life on the line there and the risk of his own death there. He showed immense personal courage there. Mr. Zingeris is one of the great personalities of European politics, and I want to acknowledge that, and I'm very privileged and honoured to be his friend, to be his colleague on the Council of Europe, and to listen to his remarks at the Council of Europe, which are beyond insightful, as you can see. And tonight he's made another very insightful contribution. You are right, Emmanuel. If in the malign scenario that we go ahead with Brexit, Ireland will need, and we are flagging this with our European partners, we will need a solidarity package. And you are correct that we'll need the solidarity package to avoid the horrors that this fine young woman identifies as a risk. And we will need solidarity. We'll need it to get over a whole range of job issues, a whole range of services threats, a whole range of dislocations of small business, etc. So we will need a solidarity package. We would hope, we will be asking for it, we'd be hoping it would be the case, but we would truly love, to answer your question fully, Emmanuel, we would truly love that it never becomes necessary. But if it becomes necessary, yes, we will need support to maintain, because you and I, on the Council of Europe, as you know, Emmanuel, we champion the rule of law, democracy, human rights. We champion that. And those civil rights, human rights, and the rule of law will be threatened by Brexit, as it dislocates and challenges the Good Friday Agreement and breaks the Good Friday Agreement tenets and creates a border and gives oxygen to violence again. With that comes a diminution of human rights. The Good Friday Agreement is a protector of human rights. It's a protector of cohesion and of shared power, shared administration between the two traditions in Northern Ireland. And again, the breakdown of the Good Friday Agreement threatens human rights, threatens the rule of law, ultimately threatens democracy. So we would need to protect the peace, to protect civilized society, to protect European values, to protect democracy. We would need a solidarity package, and so that we could. And the result of that would be a dynamic economy, well, a relatively dynamic economy then, that would play a full part in a united Europe, and that wouldn't, because Europe has to be predicated on keeping all its parts successful. For the internal market alone, you need people with resources to have an internal market, and for the peace and for democracy, we need that. So your question is beyond insightful. It's also a generous question in that you recognise the challenge that we will have and the difficulty that we'll be confronted with and the need that we will have for support and solidarity. And I know that you won't be found wanting yourself in that sphere, Emmanuel, and I know that a lot of our good friends in this room won't. I pray that it never becomes necessary. I would love that we could act sanely and keep our united Europe, keep our 500 million people in an internal market, keep this pooling of goods, services, and all of that, and the interplay of people, and the pool, and keep cultural diplomacy alive and well in Europe within all our states. And the UK is so crucial to it. It is so bleak that we would cut off the UK from the mainstream of Europe. I mean, it's beyond sad, and it would be such a retrograde step. And I think the thinking people in America, or in the UK now, recognise this. The literati, the thinking people, and I don't say that in any elitist sense, and I think it's permeating through the population in a reasonable way. It's a madness. It's the opposite of what we tried to do after World War II. It's almost trying to undo the blocks that were put together after World War II, and it's horrendous. I mean, it's just, leaving Ireland's concerns alone, it's horrendous for Project Europe.
We had one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We learn a lot more about Brexit after that. And I want to push the question a little bit forward, like the question from the lady from Portugal. So ideally, if there is a referendum and people vote this time for not having a Brexit, how possible that EU state would accept this kind of U-turn? Because it has been a long discussion of like, okay, we're going to have a Brexit, so how will be the deal? And what if they suddenly say, no, we don't want a Brexit now? So how possible like EU member state would accept that and then say, okay, yes, we're going to welcome you again?
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
I'll begin. Thank you for the question, and it's a good one. Thank you very much. It confirms what I said about the quality of students that I've met here over the last few days. I'll begin with Ireland. We will embrace it. We will be just beyond joyous and happy if there's a Remain result in the UK. I honestly think whatever might be said in diplomacy at the moment and might be said in, you know, the kind of knee-jerk reactions, I'd be 90% sure that Europe would embrace it with joy and with delight, because right across Europe, because there's not a country in Europe that wants the UK to go adrift, that wants to lose such a wonderful trading partner, such a net contributor to the Union, and a net contributor of human capital as well. So it's unthinkable. No, I think it would be embraced with joy and enthusiasm, and I think everything would be done to make it possible. I think in retrospect, in the UK or in the EU, we could have been a bit more tactful and sensitive and dealt with the Cameron situation a bit better. The time that Cameron, the former Prime Minister in England, did his deal with the EU, I think we were a bit balchy with him. And if we had to give him some more concessions, to send him home with something a bit more palatable for selling to the people, we mightn't be in the position we're in today. Or if, indeed, at the time, if the Labour Party had showed the necessary leadership. But we are where we are, which is that awful cliche, but that's where we are. Yeah. So.
Questions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.